Hello, dear friends. My name is Tatiana Nikishina, and you are watching Inner Visions of People with Passion. With today's topic, we're going to start a series of about world spirituality. And for that, I invited a very special friend, Igor Selivanov. I'm going to get him connected. Don't hesitate to send questions, comments. Hello, Igor. So nice to
Hello,
see you.
hello, Tatiana. I'm glad to finally make it through.
I know. Maybe you can put a little bit your camera, so because it's going to be just half. Yeah, perfect, perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
wonderful. Hello, guys. Please come in, join us. We're gonna talk about Igor first. How did you discover this passion of yours? How did you discover Egypt?
Well, first, I guess I discovered history and ancient myths. Again, like I said before, um, I don't remember a time when I didn't know Greek myths. It just they just always, as far as I can remember, I've always known them. I don't even know what I've read or been read to. So I've always been interested in stories. And then my father got a 1001 Nights as a present for his birthday. I didn't really care very much, so he gave it to me. And I was 8 years old at the time, and I don't think my parents realized what they were giving to their 8 year old, but it was wonderful. So I've
I
always been
can
interested in
imagine.
history. I've always been interested in history. I've always been interested in myths. And about 5 years ago, when I lived in London already, I took a friend of mine to a museum, to British Museum, and I was showing her this and that. It was just a random walkthrough, and again, so British Museum is my most favorite museum in the world. And she said, "Wow, you should do tours." And I thought about it, and actually, they have some wonderful archaeologists that are guides at the British Museum. But to me, and it's interesting to me, after 5 to 10 minutes, I want to leave. It's pretty boring. So I figured, hey, why not?
Mm-hmm.
So I started doing it. I actually started with Greece, which I knew a lot better than Egypt, which was pretty much nothing at the time. But then I got into Egypt because I have a wonderful Egyptian collection. And the more I read and looked into it, the more I realized that actually a lot of things that we don't realize, they come back to actually Egypt. Egypt is really at the core of a lot of things, like going back to even the concept of Christian religion and the final judgment day, things that you wouldn't expect. They actually come back. Actually, even the yin yang concept of the Eastern, what everybody thinks is an Eastern concept, is probably originated in Egypt.
Wow.
So it's a very interesting. It is a very, very interesting place,
So
and
it's really like beginning of the beginning.
yeah, it is the origin, and then we don't realize that because we're looking at things downstream of it. But it's very interesting to see how where it began. A lot of things. So again,
I
the
understand.
more
I understand that you can talk about Egypt for days, maybe
yes,
months. So that's why I want to concentrate right away and focus on on religion and spirituality of the Egyptian people. What did they
okay.
believe? What did they believe? How the world is constructed? How it was created? Like basics of the basics. Let's start from the basic.
So basic is as in most religions actually, or at least at the religions that were there at the beginning, so to say. Um, the worldview of a people is rooted in actually in their geography. And that is why, let's say, the worldview of the Egyptians differs quite a bit, or differed quite a bit from that of ancient Greeks, to which our worldview is closer. Ancient Egypt was centered or clung to the River Nile. Life could only really exist in ancient Egypt along the River Nile, at least as of 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. And duality of life, of existence, of the world was ever present in the ancient Egyptian world. For example, the Nile would flood for 3 months in a year, and that flooding would bring life. The Egyptians called their country, the place they lived in, Kemet. Kemet means black. After the black earth that the flooding Nile would leave behind. That was in contrast to the desert that would surround all of that, which effectively would be death. Wherever this black, very fertile land ended, the desert began. You could literally stand, even now, you could stand just like that. You could stand with one foot in a grass, which sprung out of the black land, and the other foot is in the desert. So this duality of life and death was ever present in their world. The sun would rise in the east. It would go above them. It would set in the west, and they believed that it would die. It would literally die and go in the underworld, and then emerge from the other side. It would be reborn. The temperature drop would be significant. That's another duality, and it would be signaled by life during the day and the time of darkness and death during the night. And that basically shaped their worldview. There's an ever-present duality that permeates everything that the Egyptians believed. So, for example, in the ancient times, they would live on the east side because that is the land of the living. That is where the sun rises, and where the sun sets, which is the west, is the land of the dead. That is where the dead go. So all the burial sites, if you think about the pyramids and all the other burial sites, Saqqara, that is all on the west side. And they literally, they saw one of the big reasons why their religion and their place in the world, the sense of their place of the world and the world we persisted for about 4,000 years, is because the things that they believed in weren't really abstract to them. They were physical. They were in front of them. So when your sun comes out at 40 degrees of Celsius, your God is interacting with you every second of your life. You can feel the presence of your God. There are no clouds. There is no rain. There is no competition for the sun god. That is the entity that brings you life. Is nothing else really that is greater.
So the god Ra, he was the main god, right?
Yes, he would sometimes merge, and some gods would be the Amun-Ra, let's say. There would be multiple manifestations of them, but one could actually they didn't really think of gods and differentiation between them the way we do. It is possible that one god could be another god or multiple of gods, which is why it may seem strange to us, but the following statement, but the entire pantheon of literally thousands of Egyptian gods could be thought of in some sense as a manifestation of Ra, in some sense. So yes, Ra was their main sun god, or the life force behind it. The river Nile, when somebody died, their body would be prepared and then transferred over to the west side, and the Nile would serve effectively. So the ancient Egyptians didn't really believe they didn't have a god of death. It's an odd thing to say and to hear, but there is no god of death in ancient Egyptians. Everything they believed in was geared towards life after death. Death was a kind of a Rubicon or a crossing.
Just some kind of examination.
They had to wake up from death. Death was actually very similar to sleep. Your soul had to wake up from death and emerge into eternal life. So Nile would represent that physically, would represent
This
that uh,
transaction.
yeah, that border, and physically they would be transferred. Again, this wasn't an abstract thing. Here is the land of the living, and that is the land of the dead. And when you are transferred, you are physically uh,
It's
being
like life.
transferred to the land of the eternally living, not the dead.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the land of the living and the land of the eternally living.
Wow.
And you didn't have to believe in it. It was in front of you. So that is very important aspect of their religion. It is this duality and the fact that the physicality of it was ever present. It is very, very important to realize how much geography, what part geography played in their worldview.
Does Egyptians had some kind of books that they were based on? Like, for example, Christians have Bible, Hinduism has Bhagavad Gita. The Egyptians had some kind of like a ancient thing that they will be based their beliefs on, or they were just
So
like no. That's
So unlike the religions you mentioned, the ancient Egyptian religion is roots in the prehistoric, and prehistoric means before written word. History begins when people started to write things down. Before that, there is no history. It's called prehistory. So their religion is rooted in beliefs that are prehistoric. If you look at their gods, this isn't true for everything, but in general, the animal gods that are present, Sekhmet, Anubis, the Shackle god, the lion goddess, and many others, the reason why they're animals is because long time ago, they believed in an animalistic religion where they were hunters and gatherers and would follow the flocks, and they believed that there would be gods that were in charge of those animals, and by propitiating giving gifts
kind
to
of like
those gods,
meditating
they
on
could
them.
control. Well, you give them gifts. You could control, or you could help them. You could ask the gods for help in controlling those animals or dealing with those animals. Later, when religion became a bit more abstract, these gods transferred. They were appropriated, and
How
then new
interesting!
gods
How interesting! They
appeared.
just got inside. They just like, okay, come over, be with us.
Yeah,
That's very
it's a
exceptional, actually, comparing to the further civilizations. They will just wipe out whatever was before. This
no,
one will
no, no, no,
include
no,
those.
no, 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 not at all.
Hunter. Uh-huh.
All of the religions, I would say, all of the religions appropriated gods from either other religions or even religions that existed in the place that we're in. Christianity is a great example. I mean, we can talk about how much it took from ancient Egypt. But no, actually, that is the normal course of events where religion is, especially prehistoric religions, before the written word. What happens is when something is written down, it ossifies. It becomes a lot more static and difficult to adapt to changing circumstances. So it's easy to adapt gods, to change it. You just tell a different story. But once you write it down, it becomes a bit more difficult. That's actually a good example is the Odyssey and the Iliad. For 400 years, those stories were told in different vein. That's why Greek myths sometimes contradict themselves. But once they were written down in the 9th century BC, they ossified and they became, they became dogma, and they became less relevant. Once something is written down, as time progresses and things change, it's much difficult to change it, and they become less relevant. As you can see with current religion, it lost meaning. It's much more difficult to change it once it's written down. But generally, all religions developed. They move and they adapt to the needs or the worldviews of the people.
Great. So let's go back to gods, gods of
Okay.
Egypt. So the main is Ra. All others, some kind of, okay, let's not say that, like everything is Ra. and all of the others, they're some kind of reflection of Ra.
Well, there is one other, yes, except for one thing, one God, which is sometimes he's actually with Ra and sometimes he's not, but he is very, very important. I would say he is the doppelganger of Ra, and that is Osiris. Osiris is the god of eternal life, not the god of death. He's not Hades. He is the god of eternal life. We can talk about him because he is actually where the Christian religion gets its concept of the of judgment day. But it is an absolutely crucial, probably central aspect of ancient Egyptian religion. So Osiris. Let's talk about who Osiris was. Osiris was a lovely god. He was a god. He was a pharaoh, probably the first pharaoh, and he was married to his sister Isis, and they were wonderful. Everybody loved them except for one entity, and that is his brother Seth. Seth was a god of borders, chaos, and desert, and not very good things. Like so,
Self.
he was of things that would oppose what they called ma'at, and that is the way that things should be. So he planned to kill his brother, and what he did is he secretly took a measurement of him, and he created the first sarcophagus in the history of of the world, and it was very pretty sarcophagus, golden, it's very, very pretty, and he rolled it out at one of the god's parties, and he said, whoever fits into this container can keep the container. So all the gods started to, try to fit into it, and some were too fat, too long, too short. And when Osiris lay down in it, he said, hey, it fits me perfectly. It's mine. And Seth said, yeah, it's yours. And he closed the lid. He sent it off on its way. And the sarcophagus floated, and out of it grew out a big tree. So Isis, she started to look for her husband. In fact, her symbol is the empty throne. If you see a goddess with an empty throne, that is always Isis, because the empty throne symbolizes the most important time of her life, and that is when Osiris wasn't there. So she finds Osiris. She brings him back. But Seth finds out about him, even though he's dead. He steals him and he cuts him into many, many pieces. And he throws out, he cuts him into many pieces and he disperses it throughout Egypt. So Isis, who is, by the way, the goddess of both love and magic, she finds all the pieces except one. And the one piece, you guessed it, is the penis. Yes, it is. So the god Thoth makes a penis out of clay, by the way, same thing that Adam was made of, for him. And Isis, I kid you not, blows life into Osiris. And I could show you pictures.
Sure.
Pretty much I'm not going to show you pictures, but it's like 5,000-year-old documents of holy porn, basically. So
wow.
She blows life into him with her love and magic, basically. And she keeps him alive for exactly so long as to have him inseminate her. And then she lets him pass. Now, he then passes, and he, through a lot of other things. So it's so her son is actually Horus, and that is also a very, very, very important god. It is the falcon. And he is the son of Osiris, and when he grows up, he will fight against his uncle, Seth, and defeat him. But now this is difficult to understand for us Westerners, but perfectly understandable to ancient Egyptians. The god Horus, who is not even born yet, who has just been begotten, gives his eye, the eye of Horus. By the way, any time that you see an amulet that has an eye, whether it's Turkish or Jewish, anything that has to do with an eye comes from the eye of Horus, one of the most powerful amulets of defense against the dark forces that exist. So he gives his eye to his father, having not been born yet.
Yeah.
for the sake of his father's rebirth. Totally understandable to ancient Egyptians. So his father is born, and he is the first entity that has defeated death. This is why everybody else comes to him, and this is why he is actually supersedent, and he is ascended to all the other gods. He is the only god to have conquered death. He has died and conquered death. This is why Osiris is preeminent. When Ra, in his chariot, he actually transfers to the ebony chariot at the end of the day. He passes into the kingdom of eternal life, and he joins with Osiris. They actually join into a single entity for a brief but eternal moment, after which they separate again, and Ra emerges. Now, to Egyptians, the Egyptians and we should equate death with time, because what death is time. Where there is no time, there is no death. So they had two concepts of time, actually. One of them is called Nechech, and the other one is called Jet. So the Nechech time, this is very different from our time, which is history. It is something that goes forward inexorably. And that we get from, by the way, from Greeks. Egyptians had a very, very different concept of time because of this duality, which was cyclical. Everything in their world was cyclical. So Nile, it might flood a little, it might flood a lot. It never floods the same, but it always floods every year. So the differences in this cyclicity, it is the eternal recurrence, and they call that Nechech. It is basically, every the throne on which the pharaohs sit. Every pharaoh is different. That is Nechech. They change. It is the eternal change. However, the throne itself is eternal, and the flooding of Nile itself is eternal. And that is the Jet time. That is the time of eternal existence. So things eternally recur, but some things, or eventually, they stop recurring. They have a beginning, they recur, then they stop, and they continue. So, for example, that is true of a human soul or a human person. We are born, we did not exist, we start, we end. Well, we die, we wake up from death, and we continue in time jet. The pyramids were built for time jet, and so far so good. They're still continuing.
That's
so
sure.
It's very different. They built the pyramids in a very different way that they built anything else. Everything else was built out of adobe, which was brick. Even castles, even the houses in which the pharaohs lived, were built out of something that was not expected to last. The pyramids were expected to last in jet time. So they have this time. So Ra exists in a time that is living. He is in living time, and he dies. Osiris and Jet exist outside of time. Ra joins with Osiris, and he is out of that joining, he emerges again. It is the only entity that can, outside of the, I'm not going to get into it, but the scarab is actually a representation of Ra. It is the scarab holds the sun. You always see a scarab holding the sun. Because actually the scarabs are born out of feces, out of a ball of feces in which their eggs are laid. Ancient Egyptians didn't understand that. They saw the scarabs emerging from not just nothing, but, pardon the expression, shit. And in that they represented the only other entity that could do that, self-generate is the sun. So that is why they are, kind of held together. In fact, the scarab, they call them Khepre, is the symbol. It's the god of the rising sun. He helps to push the sun from beyond the horizon. So again, that's your duality. You have time
right there,
and death and Nechech out of, and then you have Jet, which is eternity, or rather, they're both eternal, but one is eternal recurrence, and the other one is eternal continuation.
So
Osiris,
I assume for Egyptians themselves, not the god, but Egyptians who believed in that, their understanding of death and their life was obviously, since they were born with that, they learned, was taught to that since very early age. They
yes.
probably were completely different mentality, completely different goals in life, right? Would it
Um,
change their custom?
Not really. Well, similar, no, I would say there, you see, human nature is the same for all people.
Yeah.
And their religion takes forms to adapt, or rather, people, they adapt their geography, or they take the geography and they create their worldview, but they adapt it to to
To their own
to
needs.
human nature.
Right.
So, for example, and this is where we come to where there's a great overlap with Christianity. I'll continue with Osiris. When a person, so they had a concept of Ma'at. That is the way that things should be. They didn't have to be saints. They merely had to be the way they were expected to be. When they died, they entered a sort of a video game, a quest, and uh, well, everybody prepared for their death. In accordance to their financial situation. So the more that it was great business. The priests that were in charge of overcoming death were the richest caste in the entire Egypt. And there were all sorts of things that you could buy, from statuettes to secret tests, the Book of the Dead. It is to help you defeat all the things that stood between you and something called the Ma'at Heru. Ma'at Heru was it is a place that you came. It is the weighing of the heart. And when you came in front of Osiris, you brought your heart. They believe that your essence, your human, the culmination of everything that you were was in your heart. And you brought that on the way to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. So against the way that you're supposed to be. And if your heart was too heavy with sins, basically, then it would weigh too much, and this thing with the hind legs of a lion, the body of a hippopotamus, and the head of a crocodile called Ammon, it would eat your heart, and then you would die a second final death. There was no hell; there was just unbeing. But if you were true of heart, so to say, you would pass this test and you would join the Ach, or the Ahu, which is kind of like the Brahman in Buddhism or in Hinduism. It is the conglomerate of all the souls that were holy. You pass the test.
And then you start again. Then you're allowed to start again.
You do not. No, you do not start again. You exist eternally in this state. So this is why. Everything that I've said before, you have. This is why Christianity, when it came to Egypt at around 3 to 5, 3rd to 5th century AD, it is the first religion that was able to supplant the ancient Egyptian religion because it was so close to it. Because you have a God, and you have an offspring of God, Jesus or Horus, who defeats, or who is in eternal battle against the forces of evil, which is Seth, and you defeat it, and you have to pass the final judgment, which is the Ma'at Heru, when your soul is judged. By the way, when you pass the Ma'at Heru, you have to say, I believe it's 90 things you did not do, such as I did not sleep with my neighbor's wife. I did not murder anyone.
Just 9?
No, there were 90.
90. Okay.
They were pared down to 10 eventually, well, by Judeo-Christians, but they existed. There were 90, but they had to be said in a negative sense, meaning that you said, I did not do this, I did not do that, I did not do this, and you had to say 90 things you did not do. And by the way, they realized that, again, Egyptians were very pragmatic people. So if you could afford one thing, for your afterlife. You would buy the scarab. It was a scarab amulet, and it would be put on your heart, and it had a spell on it, and the spell would say the following: "My heart, do not be a witness against me. Do not betray me in the most important moment. Do not be a witness against me." And that amulet was supposed to hold the heart from spilling all the beans on how you really lived during your life, during the Ma'at Heru.
So you could cheat.
So, well, sort of, yeah. And then there were other things, but what was the most important thing that would be put on your heart? The scarab. So they understood human nature, and they were very lenient towards themselves, so to say. But you could see where the Christian religion kind of it is a very interesting thing where it is probable that it was taken into the Levant area. It developed over, I don't know, 1,000 years, and it came back to conquer in a slightly different form Egypt, which produced it. And that is kind of also to answer the question or the comment that you made before. Religions they never start from nothing. They are always, all of the religions have come from something that existed before.
Of course. Can you tell me a little bit about female and male gods? Is there, or there were just one, the one that's safe?
No. There were many gods.
And how
many
did
of them were female.
each other?
Well, let me tell you about the females in ancient Egypt. So I would say that is I think a good way to answer how they interacted with each other. So I would say that until 200 years ago, there was no better place to be or to be born and live or have lived as a woman at any point in time in human history than ancient Egypt. A woman was an equivalent from the legal point of view, from the court's point of view. A woman was an exact equivalent to a man. She had exactly the same rights. In fact, marriage. What was marriage in ancient Egypt? It was not something made in heaven as it is in Christian religion. The gods were not participant in that. Nor was it a civil union. So the government did not participate in it either. It was, in the modern sense of the word, a prenuptial agreement that was actually drawn up and agreed upon and signed and would have force in the court. And it could be, however two sides agreed, they would live together and separate should it come to that. That is how it would be. I'll give you an example. There was a prenup agreement found where if a man was found to be unfaithful, he would have to return the dowry with a 50% addition to it, to a woman.
Nice.
So, yeah, indeed, very nice. A woman could own property. She would inherit property of a man should he die. She had full, when she brought dowry to the house, it was her dowry. It was not given to the man. It was hers to do what she willed with it. There were certain things that she could not do, and certain professions that she could not have. But for all intent and purposes, she was an equivalent of a man. And the life that they had together, that they lived together, rather, the concept of marital bliss was very similar to what it is now. Now, that's not to say that they all married for marital bliss. Just like now, there are many reasons that people get married. And just as it was now, so it was then. But in principle, you could not just force a woman to marry, and this would be legal. Now, this is in direct contravention to ancient Greece, the classical Greece that we know and love. I would say that's probably the worst place that you could be born and live as a woman. In fact, let me give you a little bit. I want to do a little segue into ancient Greece, because it's so different, and our culture comes from ancient Greece. Now, their religion is vastly, well, actually, a lot of their gods came from ancient Egypt. Zeus, Pluto, goddess of love was actually Isis. So it came from ancient Greece, but their worldview was very different, and it was very different because of their geography. In ancient Egypt, the geography was and the climate was very predictable, very important. For thousands of years, nothing changed. Nothing changed. And that allowed ancient Egyptians to have to be able to project a wellness, or they could project well-being onto eternity, because their climate and their geography was amenable to that. Not so for Greeks. Ancient Greece is not a hospitable country. This is why they had so many colonies. They were people forcibly ejected from the cities of Athens, Sparta, etc., because the land could not support that many people. Very inhospitable sea. This is why they developed the concept of xenos, which is a favorable. You had an obligation to a traveler that had met misfortune. You had to be nice to them, because everybody could find themselves in this situation. So they could not project well-being into tomorrow, not to say eternity. Let me give you an example. When Odysseus is told to go to the underworld, and be told by the blind, by now dead seer Tiresias where he needs to go next. So he goes to the underworld, he spills the wine, and he waits for Tiresias to come. And interim, a lot of souls come and go, and he talks to them. And one of the souls that comes is, by then dead or killed, spirit of Achilles. Achilles is like, he's the epitome. He's the superhero. He's like how you want to be. He's the epitome of how you want to be as an ancient Greek. And Odysseus says so much to him. Oh, epitome of how everybody wants to be. How is it like? What's it like to be dead? And Achilles, this is written down in the Odyssey. He says the following: I would rather be a slave or a servant, which is even worse than a slave, because a slave at least is forced to be a slave. A servant has sold himself willingly. So he says, I would rather be a live servant than a dead Achilles. This is the epitome of how a Greek wants to be, saying this. And this epitomizes how Greeks viewed the afterlife. It was a very bleak affair, because they could not project their geography and climate, could not, and just the surrounding with constant lookout of being attacked.
Let's go back to Egyptians. They would see afterlife, either you're in as a Brahman state kind of world, or you eaten by this hippopotamus, right?
Yes, exactly.
So it's like either that's pretty much
well,
like
you live.
paradise and hell.
Not
hell,
yeah,
like
pretty.
food, yeah.
It's paradise and non-being.
And nothing. Yeah.
Let me finish just a very nice thing.
Okay, go ahead, and then
Let me just finish with this.
I promise
Yes.
we'll do another one about Greece. I definitely want to hear about that.
I'll be just very quick.
Sure.
Whenever you see statues of ancient Egypt, they're all, they're frozen. They are static. This is not because they couldn't display motion. They could display motion just fine. You have to remember that ancient Greeks at about 600 to 700 BC started to do sculptures, and they took it from the Egyptians, who have been doing that as sculptures for 2,000 years by that time. But the Egyptians, the sculptures they did were for the jet time. The sculptures were to represent eternity. That they didn't need to represent Nechech. Nechech is not something you strive for. All of their sculptures were for time jet. But when the Greeks took the skill of doing sculpture very quickly, within 100 years, they had adapted it to their own worldview. And to the Greeks, the most important time of your existence is the time between your birth and death. It is the Nechech to the Greeks is the most important, which is why they learned to make the stone cry and move, which is why the Greeks make the stone move. It is because their worldview is so different. This is why Greeks make the stone move, and Egyptians don't. They actually have it frozen. So it goes back to their religions, worldviews, which goes back to their geography.
Oh, let's go back to female gods. I want to hear
Okay.
about female gods and male gods. So did
Um,
they being like in Greek mythology, playing in the forest, meeting with each other
uh,
by the river and stuff?
well,
Or Egyptian
I
gods are
was
more serious?
no, no, no. Egyptian gods are actually no. There is I could tell some bawdy tales. I
Please
don't know if I
do.
should.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I already told you one. I told
Okay.
you one, and that is how Isis had blown life into
I know
Osiris
that was
again.
very
You can
unexpected.
you can imagine there is a 5,000-year-old papyrus that shows it very explicitly, with
Wow.
Anubis holding the money of Osiris
Uh-huh.
and Isis blowing life into Osiris.
My
Um,
God.
so
Who would have
they
think?
who would have thunk actually their I mean sexuality. In fact, I would say that sexuality was an open affair.
Hmm.
Pardon the pun. In all religions outside of Judeo-Christian, there was no suppression of it. There was no. There was nothing. There
Taboo.
was nothing
Hmm.
indecent. Well, yeah, it was. It was. It may have been private things, but it was not taboo, either in religion or in the bedroom, or there is in Greek religion, there's statues of Pan, doing a goat, and it was considered to be humorous. There is let's say a tale of dominance. So actually, well, you wanted to know about
Female
female
and male.
goddesses.
Yeah, female
Um,
goddesses.
I
Is
would
there was
say that
who was the most important? I
female goddess.
yeah. Is there was someone important there, or they were pretty much like reflection of the male god? Like if you
I
would
would
say,
say no, no. They had their own females. They were responsible for things that male gods were not, such as, let's say, the goddess of erotic love and magic, and that is Isis. I would say she is the most. She is the most. She's the grandest. I wouldn't say the most important in the sense that like preeminent like Ra and Osiris. She would just be the grandest. But there were others. There was the goddess of birth, let's say Taweret, who is the pregnant hippopotamus. There's Sekhmet, which is the destroyer. She is the goddess of plagues and war. She is the war goddess. Actually, very funny or
so
interesting
it's a
that
female who's a goddess of war. It's a female. It's a
we have to remember that in Greek religion, the goddess of war is actually Athena as well.
yeah.
Ares was god of war, but actually Ares was the most hated god by Greeks. He was the one that had the least shrines. They thought him cowardly and bloodthirsty, which reflected their understanding of what war was really about. And their nitty gritty was Ares, like the bloodthirsty aspect of it. But the wisdom, the conceptual glory of war and what it brought to you, that was represented by Athena, a woman. Similar, well, not similar, but for Egyptians, the goddess of war was Sekhmet. She's
Mm.
also the goddess that is bloodthirsty, and there is a
Is
myth about her. Mhm.
is there a goddess of earth, like Mother Earth symbol?
Um,
She's a
Funnily,
woman, or
so it's a funny thing. It's a funny thing. There is a goddess of sky, and her name is Nut, and she is the one that is actually the fertile goddess. It's a god of earth. The earth god is Jeb, and he is a man, unlike Gaia. So their equivalent of Gaia, Earth, is the sky. You have to remember, actually, geography. The Earth of Egypt is not fertile. There's only a little
right.
aspect of
It's a
it that's
desert.
fertile. And I had a special god of Nile, whose name was Hapi, and he was a man with breasts, of which the Nile was actually. So he was androgynous. He had an aspect of both man and woman. He was a man with breasts, and the two branches of Nile, the blue and the white Nile, would join. They knew that the Nile originated in two branches. They would flow from his breasts. So he was actually both a man and a woman. That's why there is no god. Well, the god of earth, he is not really. You don't have to make it a woman because it's not fertile. Nile is fertile. Earth is not.
So water is fertile.
Yeah, water's fertile. And
Mm,
that's the aspect of happy that is probably
right.
female. It's what flows from his breath. Again, it is this mutually incorporating duality. It is the symbiosis of two things, including man and woman, in happy himself.
Mm. That's why we're in their regular life, in the common life, they were pretty much equivalent to each other as well, right? Man and woman.
Um, it's difficult to
Because
tell
they still
why.
have like example to follow from gods.
Well,
No,
it's difficult
still
to
not
it's difficult to say where things, what
coming
whether
from.
the myth,
Hmm.
where the myth is, where
What is originate first, right?
yeah, what is original, what's the egg, and
Egg or
and what's the
chicken? Yeah,
chicken.
yeah.
So because, but so let's say the Pandora myth in ancient Greece, which puts all the blame, by the way, also another source of Christian hatred of the woman, basically. Ancient Greeks they had assigned all the ills of the earth to the woman. It's to Pandora, who opened Pandora box. It's easy to to be disdainful to women when you have that
Someone to
the
blame.
first woman. So it's difficult to see what came first. Whether it's the myth and then the reaction to it, or whether it's the way that you are towards a woman and then a myth comes to justify.
We have a little bit time left. I'll come back.
I can hear you, but
Now I see you well. We have a little bit of time left. Can you talk a little bit about pharaohs? Are they were like
about
pharaohs? Are they like a
pharaohs.
gods
Okay.
on earth, or?
Yeah, so pharaohs are very interesting. So another thing, ancient Egyptians invented many things, and one of the things that they invented was the monarchy. The monarchy was invented in ancient Egypt, and what that means is the consolidation of power at the very top, a pyramid of power, in fact, that is that at the very point has a single entity on which is the pharaoh. And another reason why their religion, or rather, not even religion, but the worldview and the way that they carried on their sovereignty, the way that they ruled or have themselves rule, lasted for such a long time, is because they associated the pharaohs, or the ruling class, with the gods. And that is to say that the rulers on earth were set to represent or mirror what happened in the sky. And that means that there were forces of chaos that Ra and Osiris would guard Ma'at against. In the same vein, the pharaoh would do the same thing on earth. He would be the earthly representation of someone who fights against the forces of chaos on earth. And he was, in fact, the offspring of Ra, the sun god. In fact, their main title, the praenomen, was literally called the Son of God. It's represented by a duck and a sun. So the duck means, in ancient Egyptian, the duck is Za. Za is also the sound that means sun, son of Ra. Son of Ra, Nechtaneb, son of Ra, etc. Son of Ra is the pharaoh. So when you fight again, when you want to, if you're a general or someone who craves power and you want to dislodge the pharaoh and become one, it's not enough to just raise an army. You have to explain who the hell you are to dislodge a son of God. And because it was very
Right,
important to the
right.
people to know that they are led into eternity, into Jet, by a divine
Divine.
being. And if you're just some warlock that has risen an army, you're not
You
going to
have no
get
rights.
any support. So you have to, that is why it is extraordinarily rare. It happened, like the pharaohs being overthrown. But it is a very rare affair, and people that have done it had to come up with a story, a very convincing story as to why they did it or could do it, and are really also sons of Ra, and people before them weren't. So That's a few words about the pharaohs.
Pharaohs, they weren't born into be pharaoh family, right? They were elected.
No, no, no. They were not only were they born generally, they weren't always born. Most of the time they were born.
They were born.
Sometimes sometimes the pharaoh, however, would choose not the eldest son, or he could even choose someone else if he didn't have sons, or if his sons were idiots. He could choose someone else. He would actually, now the Egyptians were very, very conservative. And to preserve or to ensure a safe transfer of power, pharaohs very well, as of a certain time, around, I would say, 1800 BC, they started a tradition of having a co-regent. So if a pharaoh thought that he would rule for another 10 years, he would take a co-regent, another co-pharaoh, who would rule alongside with him. And when he died, the co-pharaoh wouldn't inherit the throne. He would just continue to be the pharaoh who he was politics. For 10 years. He would just continue it. So there was no transfer of power. It was a continuation of power. And that is what they strive, it wasn't always possible. Didn't always work out that way. But that is something that they, wanted to ensure for the sake of, ensuring that, because it was remember that it was very important to them that their name and their cult would continue to exist. Their name had to be said and their cult had to give them offerings. It was very important who followed you. It's not like, free for all after me. Very important to have your line or people who were, you trusted follow you. So that is what they did.
And there were female pharaohs, right?
No. Well, there were, but that was, now it's a very funny thing. You would say, why? So it was anathema to everything they believed in. And all the very few pharaohs that existed, except for Cleopatra, who was the last pharaoh, but she was, that was kind of the end of Egypt, actually became a Roman province. But every female pharaoh that came before, she would be basically equated to the devil, and her after she died, or maybe even discarded during her reign, but definitely right after. All of the female pharaohs were there would be a policy of destroying their all the mentions of them. Hatshepsut is a great example. Her not the son, but the son of her husband, once she died, immediately ordered the destruction of all mentions of her, whether name or physical representation. Now, it's very easy to see why. Even though women are fantastic, the monarchy represents what's happening in the divine world. And in the divine world, at the epitome, the gods that hold up Ma'at against the forces of chaos are not female. The female goddesses are fantastic. They do their thing. But the defenders of Ma'at are not female. So when you have someone declare herself, the representation of that on earth, that is not Ma'at. It cannot be. It is chaos. That is why they could not have a woman as a pharaoh. A woman could do a lot of things, but not be a pharaoh, because it needs to be a reflection of the divine, and it isn't. So no, that was not acceptable.
Fantastic. I had a couple questions from people who's watching us. Hold on, just give me 1 second. I'll find this. It was an interesting question. Do you think there is a connection between the eye of Horus and the pineal gland? No, I don't think so. I know that I know this theory, and that it looks like it, and that if you shape certain attributes of Egyptian insignia, you get like the brain and whatnot. But my comment, I'm just going to say no, and the only thing I'm going to discard it with, there's many ways. I mean, no. But remember that the brain
was nothing to the Egyptians. They scraped the skull clean of the brain. That was the first thing they did during the mummification process. And they filled it with sap so that it would solidify and hold the head together. So the brain was a useless thing to them, even though they actually realized that the brain had something to do with controlling your body, but it was useless to them for the jet time. Useless. They scraped it clean, your head, and filled it with something they felt was much more useful, and that is tree sap.
Oh, Igor, that was fantastic. I would really love to continue this. Let's do next one about Greece.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay,
sure.
Super. Thank you. Guys who was watching, please don't hesitate. If you're in London, reach out to Igor. He does amazing guided tours in London British Museum, right?
Not only, but yes.
Yeah, no, you do it when you're in New York, you do those in New York as well.
In the
So
Metropolitan, sure.
just follow Igor, and you will see wherever he is, and you will get yourself a great treat. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Bye. My dear friends, I had a great time. I hope you did too. Thank you so much for watching, and don't hesitate to write me direct comments if you have any subjects that you would like to hear about. Peace, love, and equanimity. Bye.